On 4 February 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt sat wrapped in a heavy naval cloak, breathing shallowly as aides whispered nearby, while the fate of continents waited silently beyond the walls of Yalta. His hands trembled from illness and exhaustion, yet his voice carried warmth and confidence, masking a deep, private pain known only to his closest advisors. Across the room, maps lay open and scarred, red lines pressing westward toward Berlin, signaling a Soviet tide that made generals watching from afar uneasy. Far away in Europe, General George S. Patton paced the stone floors of his quarters, boots echoing, convinced the war's final act was being mishandled. Patton believed the Red Army was a temporary ally, a force to be checked, not empowered, and he feared Washington was surrendering leverage. Quietly at the table in Yalta, for Roosevelt, the choice felt cruel and immediate: end the war quickly or risk millions more dead. While Stalin waited, armies already in position across Eastern Europe. Every signature in Yalta carried hidden costs and silent victims. Borders would shift without consent, and decades of tension would follow. Long after victory parades faded, that winter moment bound Patton's fury to Roosevelt's compromise, setting a course neither man could fully control. As the world edged toward a divided peace under Stalin's watchful eye, Yalta itself felt distant from battle, yet heavy with consequence, chandeliers glowing over exhausted men. While decisions traveled faster than any army could move, across a shattered continent, in the days ahead, alliances would harden and secrets would surface, revealing why one American general felt abandoned and why Europe would pay the price for a hurried peace. On 7 February 1945, news of Yalta filtered slowly through Allied headquarters, carried by coded cables, guarded language, and uneasy silences. General Patton read between the lines with growing anger, sensing concessions buried beneath polite, diplomatic phrases. Concessions he believed soldiers had not earned with blood. In Luxembourg, his Third Army stood poised and aggressive, engines humming in frozen fields, men ready to drive east. Before politics drew invisible lines, Patton's fear was simple and brutal. Armies decide futures, not promises made in distant palaces, and Stalin already occupied what Roosevelt was negotiating away. Meanwhile, in Washington, Roosevelt faced pressures unseen by the public: a failing body, a weary nation, and a desperate need to end the war before collapse. He trusted that cooperation with Moscow might stabilize peace, believing Stalin could be managed through goodwill, shared sacrifice, and post-war institutions still unborn. But goodwill was a currency Stalin never spent freely. His generals consolidating control, his secret police following closely behind advancing units across Poland and beyond. Each mile the Red Army held became a bargaining chip, transforming battlefield momentum into political ownership. While American forces were ordered to halt and wait, to Patton, this pause felt like betrayal, a deliberate slowing that gifted territory, stripping meaning from victory earned at Normandy and the Ardennes. The distance between the White House and the front lines widened dangerously, misunderstanding turning into resentment, strategy clashing with survival instincts shaped by war. As February dragged on, the outlines of a divided Europe sharpened, and Patton's warnings grew louder, even as Roosevelt's time and options quietly ran out. By 15 February 1945, Patton's frustration hardened into conviction as reports confirmed Soviet arrests, and American objections went unanswered. In Poland and Romania, civilians vanished overnight. Local leaders were quietly replaced, while Red Army officers enforced loyalty behind Allied smiles. Patton wrote letters he never sent, pacing maps late at night, convinced Washington misunderstood Stalin or chose not to see. To him, the war's final phase demanded speed and pressure, not pauses negotiated by diplomats. While soldiers waited for orders, Roosevelt, meanwhile, received optimistic briefings filtered through advisors protecting morale, emphasizing cooperation and minimizing Soviet ambitions. His health declined rapidly that winter, shadows under his eyes deepening, each decision heavier than the last. Stalin sensed this weakness clearly, pressing demands with polite smiles, securing promises on Poland and future governments. Every agreement tightened the noose around Eastern Europe, while American armies were ordered idle, constrained by faraway signatures. Patton spoke openly to staff officers, warning that another war was forming. 1. America would regret delaying in the name of peace. By the end of February, the lines were hardening, trust was thinning, and the betrayal Patton feared was no longer theoretical. Across Europe, displaced families listened to rumors, unsure who would rule tomorrow, as borders shifted silently without their voice. The war was nearing its end, yet the peace being shaped now carried seeds of fear that would outlive victory. On 1 March 1945, the Third Army surged forward again, tanks carving through Germany as Patton pushed his men relentlessly eastward. Each advance felt like borrowed time, momentum battling against political caution, while Patton raced events unfolding behind closed doors. His troops liberated towns scarred by fear, civilians clinging to American uniforms, begging not to be left behind. These faces stayed with Patton, reinforcing his belief that withdrawal would condemn millions to another kind of occupation. In Washington, Roosevelt weighed post-war visions, the United Nations taking shape, collective security promised as a safeguard against future conflict. He believed compromise could anchor stability, trusting that Soviet cooperation might restrain extremes. But Stalin's intentions were already written in actions, secret agreements enforced by force, not diplomacy. As American units neared key cities, orders arrived to halt or redirect, lines drawn not by generals, but by signatures. Patton complied publicly yet fumed privately, calling the pause strategic blindness dressed as statesmanship. He sensed history slipping away, opportunity traded for assurances that carried no enforcement. March winds swept through Europe, carrying rumors of surrender and whispers of a coming divide. The war was ending fast, yet the peace felt fragile, shaped by exhaustion rather than justice, and fear rather than resolve. On 12 March 1945, Roosevelt received fresh intelligence reports warning of Soviet consolidation, yet the language remained cautious and restrained. Advisors spoke of cooperation and balance, framing Stalin as difficult but manageable, even as evidence suggested otherwise. Roosevelt listened carefully, weighing these warnings against the crushing reality of war fatigue. At home and abroad, across the Atlantic, Patton watched Red Army movements closely, noting how quickly promises dissolved once territory was secured. He believed the battlefield revealed truth faster than diplomacy, tanks and checkpoints speaking louder than treaties. In Germany, American soldiers advanced, then stopped again, confused by shifting orders, victory visible yet incomplete. Patton's anger sharpened into bitterness, as he realized political decisions now overruled military logic at every turn. Roosevelt's vision remained larger than any single general, a world rebuilt through institutions. Not continued confrontation, but institutions required trust, and trust was already eroding, as Stalin tested limits without consequence. Every delayed push allowed Soviet administrators to entrench themselves, rewriting local power structures while Allied protests stayed verbal. The gap between intent and outcome widened dangerously, good faith colliding with hard reality on the ground. By mid-March, the shape of post-war Europe was nearly fixed, though few yet admitted it openly. Patton sensed the final chance slipping away, history locking into place behind polite smiles. The betrayal he feared now felt inevitable, carried forward by exhaustion, hope, and miscalculation at the highest level. On 20 March 1945, Roosevelt approved final operational limits, lines that quietly defined where American armies would stop. These decisions were framed as temporary and flexible, yet on the ground they felt absolute, immovable and final. Patton learned of them through clipped orders, language stripped of explanation, authority replacing persuasion. His response was restrained outwardly, but inwardly he seethed as opportunities vanished with each passing day. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet flags rose over town halls, backed by security units and ideological certainty. Local resistance was neutralized swiftly. Elections promised vaguely, while control tightened invisibly. Roosevelt's health worsened further. Fatigue etched deeply into his posture. As he prepared for another term's burdens, he believed history would judge him on peace preserved, not territory conceded or warnings ignored. Yet peace built on imbalance carried its own violence, delayed but inevitable, spreading fear across borders. Patton watched refugees stream westward, stories confirming his darkest expectations, whispered horrors replacing optimism. He felt bound by duty to obey, yet compelled by conscience to speak, a dangerous line in wartime hierarchy. By late March, Germany's collapse was certain, but Europe's future was already decided, away from the front lines. The war's final battles were being fought while a colder conflict was quietly being born. On 12 April 1945, news struck Washington like thunder, as Franklin D. Roosevelt collapsed, leaving a war unfinished. In Warm Springs, his long struggle ended quietly, the weight of decisions passing instantly to a nation in shock. Harry Truman inherited not only victory, but commitments made in secret, and consequences still unfolding. Across Europe, Patton absorbed the news with mixed emotion, respect for the man, anger for the choices. He wondered if the pause might finally end, if momentum could yet reshape borders before surrender. But orders remained unchanged, Yalta's lines still binding, even without its architect. Stalin moved swiftly, consolidating gains, recognizing that confusion favored those already in position. Soviet administrations hardened overnight, promises of pluralism fading behind control and fear. Patton pressed forward where permitted, liberating camps, confronting horrors that reinforced his warnings. He spoke bluntly to reporters and officers, describing a future conflict that others preferred not to name. Truman listened but hesitated, cautious of igniting a new war before the last one fully ended. By mid-April, Germany's defeat was inevitable, yet the map of Europe looked increasingly unfamiliar. The handover of power in Washington did not undo Yalta, it cemented it through inaction. Patton felt the betrayal now complete, sealed by death, timing, and political restraint. On 7 May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, church bells ringing while soldiers exhaled in exhausted relief. Across Europe, celebrations masked uncertainty as armies paused and borders hardened beneath the surface. Patton watched victory unfold without satisfaction, knowing the war's end froze lines he believed should never have existed. American troops were ordered to pull back from certain areas, handing towns to Soviet control despite local pleas. Civilians begged to remain under Western occupation. Fear etched into faces as new authorities arrived. Patton protested privately, calling the transfers immoral and dangerous. Yet compliance was demanded. In Washington, Truman faced an impossible balance, honoring alliances, avoiding confrontation, and managing a public craving peace. Stalin exploited the moment expertly, portraying Soviet control as liberation while suppressing dissent ruthlessly. Eastern Europe slipped behind an unseen curtain, communications tightening, movements restricted, futures rewritten. Patton's language grew sharper, his patience thinner, as he warned of another war delayed, not prevented. His views unsettled superiors, challenging the narrative of unity at a moment celebrating triumph. By late May, occupation policies were fixed, logistics replacing combat, administration replacing advance. The battlefield had delivered victory, but diplomacy had delivered division, quietly and permanently. Part 9. On 1 June 1945, Patton's war shifted from movement to restraint, orders narrowing his command while scrutiny closed in. His blunt warnings reached Washington filtered and softened, framed as temperament rather than foresight. Discomfort replacing debate. Senior commanders worried his words, threatened fragile diplomacy at a moment when unity was being carefully staged. Patton sensed isolation growing around him, respect cooling into caution as political priorities eclipsed battlefield truths. In occupied zones, Soviet control deepened methodically. Police forces reorganized, borders sealed. Opposition silenced quietly. Families disappeared in the night. Newspapers changed tone overnight, and promises of free elections faded. Truman weighed reports with increasing concern. Yet reversing course meant confrontation, and the nation was exhausted. The atomic test planned in the desert loomed ahead. a new factor unseen at Yalta, altering calculations silently. Patton believed this weapon changed everything. Leverage restored if courage followed, yet decisions came slowly. Instead, he was reassigned, his authority diluted, his influence curtailed under the guise of discipline. To Patton, this felt like confirmation. Truth had become inconvenient, urgency mistaken for recklessness. Across Europe, the line between East and West hardened into routine, checkpoints becoming permanent, suspicion becoming policy. By late June, the shape of the Cold War was visible, though few dared name it openly. Patton stood at the edge of history, frustrated and sidelined, convinced that a moment to act had already passed. On 6 July 1945, the future settled into place quietly, as leaders gathered again, carrying decisions already made. At Potsdam, the language shifted, but the lines remained. Europe, divided by outcomes rooted in Yalta's winter bargains. Truman spoke firmer than Roosevelt had. Yet leverage was limited, armies already positioned, systems already installed. Stalin listened calmly, knowing facts on the ground mattered more than words across polished tables. Patton was no longer part of these conversations. His voice reduced to footnotes, his warnings labeled excess. He watched from the margins as history validated his fears. Control solidifying eastward, resistance crushed methodically. The Iron Curtain descended not with drama, but with paperwork, patrols, and silent compliance. For Roosevelt, history would debate intent versus outcome, vision against consequence, illness against responsibility. He sought peace through trust and compromise, yet underestimated an adversary shaped by power, not partnership. For Patton, the betrayal was not personal alone. It was strategic and moral, a victory surrendered without defeat. Millions would live under regimes never chosen, futures constrained by agreements signed far away. The war had ended triumphantly, yet the peace arrived fractured, fearful, and unfinished. What began at Yalta closed the door on one conflict, and quietly opened another, colder and longer. In that space between intention and result, Patton's anger and Roosevelt's compromise, Europe paid the price for peace bought too quickly.